Hello again, and welcome to a new episode on classical music rondos. In this video I'll show you two well-known examples of rondos by Mozart, from easy to not so easy, and I'll analyze them for you step by step, with the intention of clearing up any doubts that might arise in the process with regard to form. As a quick reminder, a rondo is a musical form essentially built by the alternation between a rondo theme or refrain and contrasting sections known as episodes. The nature and number of such sections is variable, as I already explained in my two previous videos on the topic, in which I strongly recommend you watch before proceeding forward, especially if you are unfamiliar with the structure of a rondo or concepts such as sonata rondo form, transition or retransition. Symphony 13, Fourth Movement. This particular movement is one of the simplest examples of short rondo form out of Mozart's symphonic production. Its structure consists of only two episodes, alternating with the refrain, the first one in the initial key's fifth degree, and the second one in the sixth degree key, which is the initial key's relative minor. The movement also displays a coda at the end, which is a brief conclusive passage, but it lacks of transitions or retransitions between sections altogether. Although, brief transitional and retransitional functions can be arguably found within the first episode, as we shall see later. Rondos with few or no transitions or retransitions at all are sometimes named by some theorists by the French spelling of rondo. However, we must keep in mind that this terminological distinction wasn't really followed by composers back in the 18th century classical period, where both spellings, Italian and French, were used more or less interchangeably, as it also happened with other terms such minuet and menuetto. This is the rondo's initial theme or refrain, which will be repeated literal each time. As you can see, there is no explicit reference to the formal structure in the movement's header, and we should not expect the composers to always give us that information. Rondo's initial themes are usually built as periods, a formal scheme that consists of two parts. In the first part we've got an initial basic idea, and this is followed by a contrasting idea that leads to a weak cadence, which can be either an imperfect authentic cadence, or, like in this case, a half cadence. In the second part we've got a restatement of the basic idea, which can be either varied or literal, like in this example. But now the contrasting idea leads to a more conclusive perfect authentic cadence, somewhat closing what the first half had left open. For this very reason, first and second half of a period are usually named antecedent and consequent, respectively. It's also worth noting that, while periods usually encompass a total of 8 bars, divided in two halves of 4 bars each, in this case we've got a 2 times bigger structure, with a total of 16 bars, divided in 2 parts. However, the hypermeter in this case, which is the sensed bar grouping beyond the notated meter, follows a 2-bar pattern, in an implicit 6/8 time signature, leading to the normative length of a period. The reason why Mozart chose 3/8 time signature for this movement, and not 6/8, is related to the character of the piece. This particular time signature is closely related to the passpide, a fast ternary dance in which the strong beat falls on every third-eighth note, a feature that would be lost if performed in a 6/8 time signature. Let's hear it from the beginning. The beginning of the first episode displays a modulating passage, structured as a 2-part stepwise descending sequence. It starts in D minor, which is the relative minor of the initial key, but this is soon to be retroactively interpreted as the second degree of the destination key, which is C major, the dominant of the initial key. Notice that Mozart displays here an elaborated variant of the fonta schema, one of the most common sequential patterns of the classical period. The second half, which is already in C major, presents a descending stepwise motion progression that leads to a perfect authentic cadence, and this all is repeated twice as a varied extension. At this point you may be asking yourself why I'm not considering the first modulating 8 bars as a transition and the next part, which starts in C major, as the proper first episode. This is certainly a reasonable question from a strictly tonal point of view, but there is also a good point against it, and that is that Mozart structured this whole part as a single thematic unit, a modulating sentence. A sentence is another type of thematic structure, which, like the period, is divided in 2 halves. The first half, called presentation, displays a basic idea that will be repeated sequentially, but it won't arrive to a proper cadence. The second half, the continuation, is in charge of leading the music to a final cadence, which could be either a half cadence or a perfect authentic cadence. Within the continuation activity, it's very common to find all kinds of elaboration processes, including motivic fragmentation and an increased harmonic rhythm. This is exactly what happens here, except that, in this particular sentence, we've got a modulating presentation and a repeated continuation, both standard variations within the sentence scheme. From a formal point of view, it'd be inappropriate to consider the fonta schema, used here by Mozart, as an independent transition section, for it behaves as the presentation of a bigger thematic unit. In my opinion, in this case, it's best to consider the whole first episode as a single theme, a modulating sentence, in which the first half, the presentation, also includes transitional activity. This kind of overlapping functions are pretty common in small-sized works, where composers might want to compress the musical materials and shape the sections into one another, in order to save as much space as possible. Notice that, while we might consider that there is no proper retransition here, if we understand it as a more or less extended passage, there is indeed a compressed retransitional function, but it's reduced to this brief lead-in that modulates back to F major at the very last moment. The second episode, which is in D minor, is built as a rounded binary form. In a rounded binary form we've got an initial theme, usually repeated, which can be built as a period, a sentence, or any of their hybrids and variants. Second, we've got a contrasting middle section, usually lasting half the length of the initial theme, that serves as a musical digression. And finally, a restatement of the initial theme, which can be either literal, or varied, full, or half-length. The initial theme of the second episode is built as a special variant of the period, known as anti-period, in which the order of the cadences is reversed. This time the antecedent ends in a perfect authentic cadence and the consequent does so in a weak cadence, in this case a half cadence. Then it follows a brief contrasting middle section. And finally, the restatement of the initial theme, that now is artfully turned into a normative period. And right before the end of the movement, after the third restatement of the refrain, Mozart introduces this brief coda to bring the work to a more conclusive ending. Now, let's see how this all works together. Easy enough, isn't it? Let's go for something a bit more challenging. Piano Sonata 13, third movement. In this movement we can see a more sophisticated variant of the rondo form, which is the rondo sonata, or sonata rondo. Here, the first episode reappears later in the movement, but now in the initial key, meaning it behaves as the secondary theme zone of a sonata form. As usual in sonata rondos, the central section is specially long and elaborated, and it presents its own internal divisions and distinctive subsections. Apart from the final coda, this formal plan also includes a series of transitions and retransitions between sections, and a cadenza near the end, which is a cliché from the concerto genre in which the soloist improvises over the previously heard music. This is an important detail, for it explicitly shows how this movement is not only a hybrid between the rondo and sonata forms, but it also includes references to the classical concerto form, as we shall see later in more detail. As usual, the initial theme of the rondo is a normative period, but in this case, instead of going for the customary repetition with a repeat sign at the end, Mozart elaborates a full varied repetition. This is not only a varied repetition. With the explicit contrast in terms of texture and dynamics, Mozart is alluding to the customary beginning of a concerto form rondo, in which a call and response relation is usually established between soloist and orchestra. As I stated in a previous video, in order for a sonata rondo to be considered as such, a normative sonata transition is required between the refrain and the first episode, normally leading to a half cadence. In this case, the transition is built as a modulating sentence, an autonomous passage on its own. The first episode, in the dominant key, acts as the secondary theme zone of a sonata exposition, and it'll be restated in the initial key later. It's also built as a sentence, but it includes a continuation extension, in which, after a first cadential resolution attempt at bars 31 and 32, that leads to an imperfect authentic cadence, the music restarts the cadential process in a more virtuosistic manner, leading to a more satisfactory conclusion at bar 36, with a characteristic long cadential trill. These are all common features of the concerto genre, with which this movement is in constant dialogue. While it's not evident yet, this retransition will be reused with slight variations in different parts of the movement, in a similar way as a concerto's ritornello, which is an orchestral passage that usually appears in alternation with the soloist interventions. The first part of the second episode starts in G minor, after the first restatement of the refrain and a second modulating transition that I'm skipping for now for simplicity's sake. It displays a sentence structure, ending with a half cadence, and it's followed by a brief inner transition that modulates to E flat major. The second part, in E flat major, is a lyrical passage built as a sentence, but its continuation will be subject to multiple extension techniques. The first one is the literal repetition, as an echo effect, of the beginning. The second one is this evaded cadential resolution, where instead of the expected perfect authentic cadence, we've got a sudden repetition of previously heard material, a technique sometimes referred to as the one more time evaded cadence. And now the biggest surprise yet. Instead of resolving the last cadential progression as expected, a new subsection suddenly begins. A developmental passage based on the refrain that starts in C minor and modulates to B flat minor, resembling in every aspect the ending of a sonata form development. At this point, given the distinctive separation between materials in the central section of the rondo, you may be asking yourself, why am I not simply considering them as individual episodes? There is one reason for this, and that's because, by definition, a rondo's episode always alternates with the refrain, a rule that is not being observed here. As I explained in a previous video, the only possible exception for this is when composers skip the refrain's restatement before the first episode's recapitulation. A final point of interest in this movement is the nature of the third retransition after the first episode's recapitulation, which behaves exactly as expected from a concerto form ending ritornello, leading the music to a cadential 6/4 suspension, after which the soloist improvises a cadenza. As this piano sonata was published during Mozart's life, it already included a written cadenza by him, but given the nature of the movement, it wouldn't be bold to assume that Mozart himself improvised it in a different way every time he performed this work, as it would be expected in the context of a piano concerto performance. Time to put all the pieces together. This is all for today. Let me know if you found this video helpful, and see you next time.